Michael Mann is the author of Ghostcloud. It's a fantasy adventure set in an alternate London. The preface sets the scene perfectly. It's a London where Big Ben beeps and Battersea Power Station belches out smoke, where bustling river markets float on the rising water and kidnapping is rife, where the Channel Tunnel lies closed ever since the old war ended. And far below, hidden underground, children are shoveling. I'm sure that our listeners will already have questions running through their heads. When did the old war end and what was it about? And why are the children shoveling underground? It's a page-turning fantasy adventure, and Michael joins me in the reading corner to tell us more.
Hi, Nikki.
So those opening lines between the preface before the story actually starts, they quickly propel us into a different world. I wondered if we could start by you telling us about the story in your own words and whether you can recall how the ideas came together.
Ghostcloud is a magical adventure about a boy called Luke who shovels coal deep underground, as you said, in this alternative London. And he's desperate to get home to his family, and who he hasn't seen for a couple of years. And then one day he meets a mysterious ghost girl who tells him that there is a way out of this power station. And this girl is called Alma, and she draws him on this whirlwind adventure featuring ghosts, the smog, the skies over London. And he realizes on this adventure that things in the power station aren't quite what they seem, and that he perhaps isn't quite who he thinks he is. And in terms of inspirations for the story, there are lots. Some of them you notice you're explicit about in your mind. So, big idea in the book is that when you see a shape in the clouds, whether it's a horse or a skull or whatever, that shape is possibly looking back at you too, and is possibly a ghost cloud. And Luke goes to this ghost cloud world and learns to do all the things these ghosts do. And that, the inspiration for that is just a lifelong love of clouds and sky, and I think lots of kids love looking and spotting shapes in the clouds. But there are other ones as well, inspirations I didn't even realize until later. So my granddad's a coal miner, and his name is Luke as well. So that was a kind of thread that I hadn't realized I'd named this character the same as my granddad, and so some of those I think had crept in. And I think then in terms of the stories, I love Wolves of Willoughby Chase, where the wolves have come in through the Channel Tunnel at the start, and Joan Aiken has a similar premise. I love Neil Gaiman's Neverwhere and any femme fatale like Mrs. Coulter or The Grand High Witch. And so I think those kind of books have also been a real inspiration in the tone and the kind of shape of the story.
I wanted to start with London. You've mentioned Neil Gaiman's Neverwhere there, but London has long been an inspiration for alternative Londons, if you like, have long been an inspiration for novelists. What do you think it is about London? Do you have a love affair with the city as well?
Yeah, I do. I was born here, and then I moved to Yorkshire, which I also love very much. But I think when you kind of have a childhood here and then move away, you sort of have memories of a place that perhaps are like larger than life. And then I came back here after uni and like rediscovered it. And I think what's special, it's got so much history and so much new and old side by side. Everywhere you look, you find interesting stories, and one of the places it's based in is Battersea Power Station, the story. And, that was a place that I discovered much later. And the more I read about it, the more I found interesting facts about it that kind of inspired the story.
Tell us what you found out.
Oh, yeah. So, for example, there used to be apparently thousands of cats used to warm themselves against the pipes of Battersea Power Station in winter, on the kind of hot water that would be pumped out of the plant. And unfortunately, they were then exterminated by as others, all these old stories, terrible things happen. But, so in my book, I was like, do you know what? I'd like these cats to live on. And so there's a whole chapter with lots of cats in it in the book. And similarly, about the smog and the Great Smog of London was in 1952, and thousands of people died, and how that led to the the Clean Air Act and all those things that probably led to Battersea closing eventually in the 1980s. And that, in my mind, was an interesting point as well. What had happened? This was a what-if question for the book. What if they hadn't put that Clean Air Act in? What if they hadn't closed the power station? Where might we be then in London?
Just while you're talking about power stations and coal, I'm talking to you the week after COP26, and here in your dysfunctional world, oil has run out and there's a return to coal power, sending carbon emissions soaring into the atmosphere. Maybe my question is more about whether you had those ideas in mind, about climate catastrophe when you were writing the story.
Yeah, I think as a teacher, you do talk to the kids as well in school about the environment often, and they're often quite passionate about it. And you study the Victorian era as well in school. And so I think those ideas were very much in the back of my mind. And it's not a sort of explicitly eco book in its mission, but it's sort of there in the background, and almost because I think as much as the book is a bit larger than life and a bit sort of like you said, a catastrophe, it is also not inconceivable that these things would happen. And I think, without over-egging the eco bit, I just wanted it to be there as the sort of world we're living in while we're having our magical, adventure in the sky. And I think it all feels very possible, doesn't? I mean, it all feels like it's very current, and it was just very much was in the back of my mind, and I didn't want to ignore it, I suppose.
Now, we're dwelling on the dark parts of the story here, but I feel that we need to find out a little bit more about the characters. Now, your main character is Luke Smith Sharma, and as we can tell from his name, he has mixed heritage. I know you've spoken about why that's particularly important to you. I'd like to hear a little bit about that, but also, apart from his name, how else is his background reflected in the story?
It's a good question. So yeah, he is half Indian, like me, and I, initially when I wrote it, I knew I wanted him to be mixed, have mixed heritage like me, and I think that was because as a child there were very few heroes in books that were half or mixed or otherwise, and I think especially not in this sort of magical adventure space. And I think that's even today. There's lots. It's so much better now. There's so much diverse stuff, but in genre fiction you don't get it as much. And I wanted to address that. And as a teacher as well, lots of kids don't quite fit the categories in some way or another. You might have. I had a kid who doesn't speak Spanish, but is a South American and identifies there. So I think lots of children see themselves as not quite here or there, and I wanted that to be reflected. And so in the book, Luke, so he is mixed heritage, but because he's been out of the sun so long in this underground place, he's very pale, and no one almost believes him. And so he sort of feels like he wishes sometimes he could be one thing properly. He wishes he could be a grown-up detective instead of halfway to being a detective. So I think that's something I explore in the book. And it's not just him. There are ghost characters who kind of aren't. A girl called Alma who feels like she should be going to the other side but doesn't want to. And lots of these children in the book start off the novel feeling a bit mixed about where they sit on things, and by the end they learn to embrace that and feel proud of it.
So it's part of his being a sort of half ghost, part of that as well.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah. So he is this half ghost, he realizes, who is kind of can travel between these realms, and at first he's a bit kind of like, oh, another half thing. Why can't I be a proper something? And then actually it's a real gift, and it's one of the reasons he can do what he can do. And his friend Jess is a girl who wants to be the first plumber in the guild, and she again doesn't quite fit what she should be doing, but she turns out to be a superstar. So it's all hopefully a bit of a celebration of the in between.
They can't do without her in the end. There is a point in the story, I'm not going to say too much, where they leave her behind. Oh. Thank goodness she doesn't listen to them, is all I can say.
Exactly.
I want to move on to thinking about Alma. So Jess and Luke, Luke was kidnapped some time ago. He spent quite a lot of time underground shoveling coal. Jess is a new arrival. She's got a slightly different perspective on their situation. And Alma is the cloud ghost. When you were naming her, I'm just interested, are names important to you, and does that name mean anything?
It does actually. My daughter was almost called Alma, and then everyone kept saying, "Oh, like Coronation Street," and I was like, "Oh no!" But I love the name so much, and I know a fair bit of Spanish, and it means soul in Spanish, and I just think it's a beautiful name, and so I gave it to Alma because she's one of my favorite characters. And she's obviously a soul, a free spirit, So it does mean something, yeah.
Tell us a little bit about her and what her situation is.
So Alma is a kind of feisty, kind of says what she thinks kind of girl who a bit headstrong, but loyal, and I'd say a bit lonely as well, and perhaps like brittle at times. And so she is a ghost cloud, and she is a ghost cloud. And the story is that just like a ghost can haunt houses, you can haunt anything. You can haunt haunt a tree, the earth, and the sky. And Alma's very much the opinion: why would you haunt a house and be hemmed in a boring house when you can fly through the sky and make it rain and do all the things that clouds can do, change your shape? And she obviously, like lots of these ghosts, the idea is that they are clinging onto this world because they have some unfinished business, and she's trying to figure out what happened to her, and that's her mystery, to find out what happened. But also, I think she's also a bit enjoys it. She's enjoying her life up there, and she meets Luke, and when she meets Luke helps her, and then she wants to help him too, and they form a bit of a bond, and I think she wants to free Luke, and Luke in a way it kind of helps her, frees her in other ways too. And so it's a really she was great fun to write. She comes at things from a very different angle and has lots of good lines, I would say.
And really that's what propels the plot along, is this idea of escape from the power station. And also as a story, this strand of the story adds a lightness to it. We've come out of the dark and we're going it's literally the pits of hell, and then we're going up into the sky where it's all light, and from the sky Luke is able to see some of the more attractive elements of London. There's a passage quite early on where it describes the water markets of Waterloo Pier. It's just joyful, almost like water gypsies, as it were, really nice description. You're going to read a little bit for us about flying, aren't you?
Yes. Yeah. I would just before I start, the name Luke also means light bringer, and so there's another kind of link there. And I think you're right. It's very much a story of, though there is a darkness in it, what I really want readers to feel is like a sense of escape and magic and being transported, and I think somewhere utterly different. And I think that's hopefully what you get once you've been pulled in the opening chapter. So we are on chapter 8. It's called The Undersky. So the sort of lower level of the sky, that means. And this is just after Luke, one chapter into Luke having been taken to the sky by Alma, the ghost cloud girl. So, falling through a cloud ravine was more pleasant than he'd expected. Logically, Luke knew he should worry. A fall from this height, even into water, would kill him on impact. But then, logically, you couldn't stand on clouds in the first place, so he ignored reason for once and enjoyed the glide. He stretched out and brushed his hands against the sides of the clouds as he fell. They felt like bubbles between his fingers. A floor of charcoal grey cloud fluff reared up towards him. He braced himself, but there was no impact. He merely sank softly into the grey. Then gradually, through the grey, faint lights appeared. Not the white light of stars, something yellower, sharper. They clustered, came into focus, and the cloud thinned out, and the glittering sprawl of London emerged. Alma grabbed his hand and pulled him to a stop next to her on a swan-shaped cloud. She gestured down at the view. To die for, right? It's something else, said Luke. The chimneys belched smoke high into the air. The river slurped brown and grey. Ant-sized people marched past matchbox houses, and even the chugging riverboats looked small. But the city seemed endless, swallowing the land in all directions. To the north, it gleamed with wealth and grandeur, regal townhouses, well-kept parks, and the rising green of Hampstead Heath. To the south, the slums stretched out for miles of barbed wire fences and corrugated iron, burning rubbish and crumbling walls, hollowed-eyed buildings and sunken streets. His dad had never let him go south, and now he saw why. Only the lights of Battersea glowed bright in the south. Alma turned to him. And now, we just need to teach you to fly. Fly? Me? Yeah. And for you, the first step is to relax. You're far too uptight. The water drops are all pent up inside you. Uptight? Luke frowned. I'm not uptight. Alma tutted. That is exactly what an uptight person would say.
That gives us a really good insight to her character, and also the sheer joy of being above it all as well. Now, it's really great to hear you read aloud, and I know you are or have been a primary school teacher. You did read aloud to your class.
Oh, all the time. Yeah, we had story time in the day. It was my favourite time of the day.
So one of the things that strikes me about your book is how well it reads aloud. And with short chapters, this is great for a teacher.
Yeah. I think for me, that is where I learned so much, was the story time and reading aloud and seeing, some books I love, actually don't read that well aloud. And some books you read and you can hear the rhythm as you read it to the children. And you know that when you finish that page or that chapter, they're going to be desperate to have more. There were those books where you would always be late for the parents because they were so exciting. And when I wrote this, I really did write it wanting it to be full of cliffhangers and page turners that I could imagine reading it to my kids at school. And also for me, I think it's always just been something I really love, the sound and the rhythm of sentences. And so for me, that's something I always do, read it aloud a lot to make sure it sounds right.
What else have you learned from the children that you've worked with? Have they inspired you anyway as a writer?
Oh, I think they do. I think, of course, that there are sometimes I remember this netball lesson the other day, and the ball landed in this girl's hand in the middle of the pitch, and she was the girl who least expected to catch it, and just the look on her face, there was a whole novel there, and she was so delighted. And so I think all the time they inspire you just through the way they react and talk in the school. But quite specifically for Ghostcloud, I think, one was this reading aloud and wanting something where the kids would be, hooked and want to know more. Another was, again, there were books I loved, like Emile and the Detectives, which I would give kids to read, but they would always get stuck in that same. There's one chapter where he has this sort of dream sequence, and the author gets quite kind of just a bit indulgent, I would say, in his description, and goes off plot a little bit. And I think for me, I saw some kids who I was desperate for them to love reading, and they would always put down the book there. And I made a vow to myself that, I have to make sure that whenever I write my book, every chapter has that hook, because you don't want to lose a single child, do you? On every time they put down a book, it's just your heart breaks a bit, doesn't it? And what else? I think the one other thing I felt as a teacher and writer is kids love words, and I know we want things not to be too hard or too easy, the proximal development. But what I decided was I didn't want to simplify the words, because I've seen kids use really complicated words once they know what they mean. So I've left in hard words, but I've tried to keep the chapters short, like you said, the story really clear, so that they're almost, even if they don't get one word, they're dragged along and they will hopefully learn that word, because it will, it'll be exciting for them.
Quite a few writers in the past have fallen into that trap. In a way, we can't get away with it today because there are so many more books around. But, when Kenneth Grahame was writing Wind in the Willows, he could go off on Pipers at the Gates of Dawn and just sort of ruminate, but you can't do that in a good children's book today. You did actually take a course, a children's writing course, didn't you, that was led by Catherine Johnson, herself a very highly regarded writer for young adults mainly. What did you actually learn about the craft of writing on that course?
She really pushed you to make everything work really hard. So I had an opening that I was very happy with, and Catherine Johnson was just like, "No, Michael, this is not good enough. You need to start with the action straight away. You need to make this paragraph isn't working hard enough." And so she really gave me this mental checklist of I always think, oh, is my dialogue too on the nose? Or, is it authentic, or am I just using it as a vehicle to kind of explain my plot? She'd always bring you back to the characters, like, why isn't he reacting or feeling more here? And she would make everything count, really. That kind of integrated writing idea of you need to be conveying all those things at once, and until you've really made that chapter work and do setting, character, dialogue, all of it at once, your work is not done yet.
That's really interesting, because even with that preface that I read out, it was evident that so much was contained in such a few lines. I know it's really hard because you're probably on to book 2, maybe finished book 2, thinking about book 3. So for me to ask you something so specific about book 1 might be quite hard, but I wondered whether there was anything that you would call actually changing, refining, very specifically as a result of those kinds of prompts from Catherine or from your tutors.
2 come to mind. So, the opening chapter started off much more descriptive, with a kind of building up introduction, setting the scene. And Catherine said, start in the action, start there. And so, though there is a very tiny few lines of describing where there is, you have Luke's dialogue and Ravi talking straight away now. And again, I think Tabitha, the villain, didn't really appear until chapter 2 or 3, and basically Catherine cut chapter 1 and we went straight to chapter 2. She said you need all those key elements in that first chapter, and she was totally right. It just makes it a really tense opening chapter that I think pulls you in. The other thing that Catherine really helped me with, and it was also the peers on the course, was thinking about writing your heritage in. I think I am half Indian, and I don't, kind of look quite pale though, and have a relatively sort of not clearly Indian surname, so she said to me, it's all very well having a half Indian character in your head, but unless you write that in, the kids who need to see that won't notice it, or people won't notice it. And so she said, again, Michael, you can work harder to make this authentic and make this, part of the story. And it was really hard because you don't read many books about half Indian kids, and so you don't know how you do that in a way. And I felt like I was sort of being a bit egocentric, almost saying, because it's, why it's a magical adventure, why is it relevant? Race wasn't in my plan. And she said, well, you need to find a way to do that. And that was, and I think we've already talked about how I did that, but that was her pushing me to work harder on that was really helpful.
Really interesting point, isn't it? Because one of the things that perhaps has beleaguered children's writing for children is what I call the Jasmine effect, where people just put the name Jasmine in and somehow that's good enough.
Yes.
That's it. We've done that now.
Yes. I was reading of that CLP report and they were talking about that there, and it was really, eye-opening. I think it's really tricky, isn't it? And I almost, weirdly, I feel like I should have known better. I almost did the same thing.
I just want to pick up one more thing that we haven't really talked about. You mentioned the villain, Tabitha. I can't believe I haven't asked you about her, because she's a pretty important part of this story.
Yeah, Tabitha, she and Alma are my favourite characters to write. Like, Tabitha, is horrible and is, I think I alluded to, I love like the Grand High Witch in The Witches and Mrs. Coulter and all these kind of femme fatale type characters, and she's definitely in that ilk. I was talking to someone, they were saying, how did you write her? And weirdly, I think I probably started with her sounds. Like, you always often hear Tabitha coming or smell her tobacco before you see her. You'll hear the click of her heels or the tap of her nails, and that was quite clear to me, this kind of atmosphere of this sort of dark power station and this her presence really before you see her. And I think that's quite exciting because Luke and her friends never know whether she's coming, where is she, right behind them? They don't know, but they know she's in the room. And she's also, what I also wanted for her is to be, she is a bit kind of larger than life in some ways, but I also wanted her to be clever and one step ahead, because I love it when heroes obviously outwit the villains, but I love it even more when the villains are one step ahead of the heroes, and your hero thinks they're going to fix it and then the villain outwits them, and obviously at the end we're going to have a happy ending, and that's important to me. But I think along the way the villain has to be not making silly mistakes. They have to be making really clever steps that make your hero's success in the end really worth it. And so I think Tabitha is like always one step ahead, and that's really fun.
Now, you said in the end, but I'm guessing this isn't the end. It's just the end of this book. So without telling us too much, have we got anything to look forward to from Luke, Alma and Jess?
Yes, they are. I have just submitted my second draft of the second book to my editor. And so, yeah, it's they have another big adventure ahead of them. That will be the end of the series. It's just a two book series. I'm trying to think what I can do. Let's just say one of the characters maybe, needs some help at the end of the book, and so there's a little they go on more of a quest, I would say, in the second book to kind of help this character. And you may not have seen the last of Tabitha, but I think hopefully you'll see more of the world as well. I think, like you said, the first book is this mix of light and freedom in the sky, and then the dark of the power station. In book 2, you'll see a lot more of, London and beyond. Yeah.
I can't wait. Thank you so much for joining us in the Reading Corner today, Michael. It's been a pleasure to meet you.
Oh, real pleasure for me too. So thanks so much for having me.
In the Reading Corner is presented by Nikki Gamble and produced by Alison Hughes. If you have enjoyed this podcast, please do leave a review for us. To find out about other projects, including an audience with events and the Exploring Children's Literature Summer School, visit www.exploringchildrensliterature.uk. Join us again soon in the Reading Corner on your favourite podcast platform.